I don't consider myself to be a particularly superstitious person. That is to say, I get the occasional kick out of the horoscope, and my boyfriend and I like to humor the idea that spirits and poltergeists exist. We even joke about how we'd haunt people when we died and came back as ghosts. In fact, my boyfriend refuses to go anywhere near an Ouija board, refuses to even think about it. "Why even tempt it?" he'd say. "Why would you want to taunt evil ghosts like that? Ghosts never play fair, and you piss one off, you're screwed." I don't think he was ever serious, just precautionary. But maybe he was right. God, this all happened so recently that I'm still shaken. I can barely write about it now without my nerves acting up. Okay, here it goes. A few weeks ago, my mom, sister, and I went to Colorado for an entire week of vacation. We were going to drive all over the state, visit the national parks, and go horseback riding and whitewater rafting and so much more. I was excited, and I sorely needed a break from work anyway. We drove a grueling 16 hours out there and spent our first day rafting down the rivers. After an extremely wet but exhilarating day, we drove to a ranch house to go horseback riding. We arrived at sunset, so it was too late to do anything, but we had all next day to ride the trails and see the sights. The ranch was dumpy, to put it nicely. It was all run down with scraps of steel everywhere. The shoddy lodging cabins were in desperate need for repair. I swear, the roof over our shack of a cabin was a giant piece of drywall with shingles stapled to the top. My sister and I thoroughly checked the place for spiders and bugs before we even thought about bringing our luggage inside. It was only for the night, I reassured myself. Just one night in a dumpy shack on a rock-hard bed that probably had bed bugs under the sheets. I shuddered at the thought. My mom tried to cheer us up. She had brought skewers and a pack of hot dogs to roast over the communal fire pit. Happy to get out of the shack, my sister and I made a nice cozy fire. And soon, a few other visitors came out to sit around the fire and roast s'mores and share stories. We talked about where we were from, where we were going, and all our adventures along the way. Pretty soon, the stories turned into tall tales and urban legends, and the sort of stuff you'd usually tell around a bonfire. That's when I spoke up. I loved stories, especially scary ones. And hey, we're out west. We're in Native American territory. Why not liven up the place with my favorite local myth, the legend of the Skinwalkers? Now, for the uninitiated, Skinwalkers are very evil, very dangerous beings. They were humans who gained the ability to take on the form of an animal by wearing its pelt, usually through very dark and taboo magic. I knew all this and told my story. Who doesn't love a good ghost story after all? Everyone seemed to be enjoying it, and I admit I took some creative liberties, really just retold an old werewolf story, but with a skinwalker as the monster instead. I improvised a lot of the story and added a few things that weren't in the myths at all. I gave our beloved frightening Skinwalker wide, crazed eyes with pinpoints for pupils, with a matching insane smile. I made the Skinwalker horribly misshapen, swollen joints and arms that were too long and legs that were too short, and a head that never sat right on its shoulders. I made it as terrifying as I could imagine. No one minded, and they actually really liked it. A man from Kentucky admitted the visuals alone were enough to creep him out. Victory in my book, if you ask me. And once I was done, everyone decided it was getting really late. Our firewood was dwindling, and it was a good time as any to turn in for the night. We packed up our s'mores and others, doused the fire, and headed to our little shacks. I tossed and turned a lot trying to fall asleep. I couldn't get comfortable on that damn bed. A rock was probably cozier than that mattress. So, against my better judgment, I got out of bed and walked about the cabin. I reasoned that if I stayed late enough, I would be so tired that I would fall asleep no matter what I was laying on. I think I briefly contemplated sleeping on the floor, but I wasn't that desperate yet. It was pitch black outside, no lights from any nearby street lamps, no car headlights. Hell, not even the cabin lights were on, and I don't remember seeing a single star. It was a bit creepy, but I shrugged off the shiver creeping up my back as simply the cold tile floor beneath my feet. I did, however, find it odd that there weren't any lights on at all on the property. You'd think there'd be a floodlight on the horse stables or in the main office. But no, nothing. That was really weird. I stepped outside in my flimsy foam flip-flops to get a better look. I could barely make out the ranch, and for some stupid reason, I decided to go walking around. Eventually, my eyes adjusted to where I could see well enough to navigate. I paced up and down the road where the cabin sat and then circled around to the fenced-in field where the horses were out grazing. Except, there weren't any horses. Probably in the stables for the night, I reasoned, and I shivered again. It was getting cold. I turned around to head back to my own cabin. It was stupid of me to be out all alone at an obscene hour, I had realized, and I needed to get to bed. But when I turned, there was something in the middle of the road. Its shape was swallowed up by the surrounding darkness, and I could barely make it out. But whatever it was tall and thin. I shrugged it off as just a pole or something else and kept walking. But then, it moved. I froze. My breath caught in my throat and I could barely breathe. I just imagined that, I said. I just imagined it. I'm freaking myself out. Get your fucking head straight. But it moved again. My paralyzed throat managed to squeak out a pathetically weak whimper as my legs began to lose strength. I shivered violently against a cold that was building up inside me. My eyes began to focus on the impossibly dark figure standing against a barely visible sleet gray night. Now I could see it. It was a person, but like nothing I have ever seen before. Its arms were impossibly long, its legs impossibly short. It had a torso far too long for its rail-thin body, and a head much too big for its pencil-thin neck. Its arms were sticking out to its side, swinging up and down. Its blockish head rolled onto its left shoulder, jerkily twitched up and down, up and down. It didn't move other than that. It just stood there, twitching, arms jerking up and down, head lolling around its shoulder. I stood there like the dumb fuck that I was. My cabin was a few hundred yards behind that thing, and I wasn't so stupid as to try to walk past it. My only option was to go around behind the cabins and the stables and hope that it didn't see me. I forced myself to lift my foot off the ground to step backwards. My flip-flop made a loud, wet, smacking sound as it cracked against my foot, and I immediately froze in horror. The thing stopped too. It stood there, perfectly straight, perfectly still, listening. I stayed as still as I could. My breath was shallow and panicked, and I tried to force myself to slow my breathing before I started wheezing. My heart thundered in my chest and my whole body was shaking, but I didn't move. Neither did it. I began to slowly, so goddamn slowly, bend over and slip my feet out of those fucking flip-flops. My feet touched the dirt and the crumbly gravel. But at least, now I could move silently. I spared a quick glance to the side to see where I was going. 2 cabins were immediately to my right, and I could slip between them with ease and disappear out of sight. I only looked away for a second. When I turned back, that fucking thing was gone. It was gone. It knew I was there, and it was coming for me. Yet I still couldn't move. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move no matter how loud my head was screaming. Run, 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 you fuck, run. I heard something behind me, and I turned instinctively. And even though I knew better, I still turned around. I was greeted with 2 bulging eyes. Oh, its eyes, staring at me and blinking with 2 black pinholes for pupils and an insane smile that stretched far too wide to be anything remotely human. My paralysis broke as I stared at the thing. I ran. I fucking ran, cried my eyes out trying to scream, but a horrible lead weight in my throat silenced me. My feet pounded on the dirt, and I stomped over anything in my way. I trampled over a jagged rock, slicing my foot wide open. I ignored the pain, and I ignored my body screaming in agony, and I ignored my own blood pouring from the wound. I didn't care. I just ran. I felt the cold creeping up my back. Oh God, the cold. It was sinking right into my bones, and I couldn't stop shaking or sobbing. And I didn't stop running until I burst into the cabin. I slammed the door shut, dead-bolted the lock, and leaped into my bed. I huddled under the blankets, hiding my head, and there... I gasped and shook for breath. And I waited. I didn't sleep the entire night. I was too scared. I couldn't get rid of that chill. All I thought about was that thing, standing there and twitching. Morning finally broke, and I finally allowed breath of relief. Whatever I had seen had not come for me, and now that it was light, it could no longer take me by surprise. My mom noticed my bleeding foot and the blood I tracked through the cabin. I shrugged it off, said I cut myself the night before when we were making s'mores. I don't think she believed me, but she didn't push it. We left not long after that, and as we left, I looked at the place where that thing once stood, and I shuddered again. But there was nothing. I assured myself there was nothing. We said goodbye to the ranchers and to our companions, and I noticed the man from Kentucky who said that he thoroughly enjoyed my story. He told me again how much he liked it, said he was going to tell his own kids when he got home. They really like scary stories, he said. And as we drove away, his head rolled onto his left shoulder, and he smiled a wide, insane smile as he waved us goodbye. My daughter Emma has always been shy. She's always had difficulty making friends, and I didn't think much of it. After all, she was only 6 years old. I just hoped that she'd gain more confidence as she grew up. So when she burst into the living room a couple of days ago shouting, "Mommy, Mommy, I have a new friend," I was happy for her. There was a worry in the back of my head that this new friend of hers might be some kind of pervert, but I brushed it off. It was much worse than that. "Oh? Tell me about this new friend, sweetie. What's their name?" "Well, it's kinda long and funny, but I just call him Mr. No-Face, 'cause he has no face." So it was an imaginary friend then. Seemed harmless enough, as long as she grew out of it. Although, something about this imaginary friend seemed off. Mr. No-Face? What kind of imaginary friend had no face? I quickly composed myself. After all, Emma's always had an active imagination. Well, what's he like? He's funny, and he's really nice to me. I sometimes play games with him too. What kind of games? Emma stuttered nervously for a moment before shuffling off to her room. I called her name, but she didn't respond. Confused, I followed her. Her pace sped up. "Leave me alone!" she shouted. At that, I stopped. I walked back to the living room in bewilderment. Emma had never acted like this before. I was saddened but concerned. What had happened to her? Did it have something to do with Mr. No-Face? I knew I had to have a long talk with her. The next day, I received a call from Emma's school. "Miss Jackson, we need to talk about your daughter." I was confused. She had always been such a nice girl. Surely there must have been some kind of misunderstanding. I arranged an appointment with her teacher at 5 o'clock the next day and asked my mother to look after her. Concerned, I asked Emma about it. "She doesn't like me. She tells me lies." "Lies? What was she talking about? What kind of lies is she telling you?" "She says Mr. No-Face isn't real." I was stunned, but I managed to compose myself. It's normal for kids to become attached to their imaginary friends, right? Maybe she was just taking her attachment too far. It's common behavior for kids her age. "Well, you know he isn't real, right, sweetie?" "He is." It was pointless to try to argue with her. She kept insisting that this Mr. No-Face was real, and eventually, I gave up and went to my room. When I arrived at school the next day, Emma's teacher was waiting for me. Her face was a mix of exasperated and confused. "Miss Jackson, your daughter has been acting strange lately," she said. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I knew what she would say. "Well, has she been watching horror films lately?" "No, why do you ask?" "Recently, she's been exhibiting some disturbing behavior." I scoffed internally. Really? An imaginary friend was disturbing. I repressed my disdain. "What do you mean?" "Well, she's been saying some rather strange things." "Like what?" "She's been talking about some thing named Mr. No-Face." "So?" I asked. "It's just an imaginary friend." "Well, she's been hurting other students and blaming it on that thing. She's also been drawing really gory pictures, and she's been telling the students that Mr. No-Face wants their blood." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words seemed to escape it. What? I managed to stutter weakly. "I highly recommend seeking help for your daughter, Miss Jackson." As I drove back home, her words kept echoing through my mind. I couldn't stomach the thought of my daughter acting like that. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, drenched in a cold sweat. When I arrived home, my mother was waiting for me, her face pale. She looked as if she was about to vomit, and she didn't speak to me. She simply looked at me in horror and ran out the door as soon as I entered, her legs trembling. Noises were coming from the kitchen. Worried, I ran inside, and I couldn't believe what I saw there. My daughter was holding a blood-stained knife. Her arms had long red lines on them, lines that oozed with blood which dripped onto the kitchen floor. She turned around to face me, her neck cracking, and her eyes were pitch black. "He wants blood, and yours will be shed." It snarled, its voice guttural and low. "Give me my daughter back, you monster!" I shrieked at a volume that I didn't even know I could reach. "She is mine," It started walking towards me, the sounds of bones cracking, accompanying its every movement. I ran to my room and barricaded it. And I am writing this as a warning to you all. If your child has an imaginary friend with no face, run. There are some things that you'd expect to get used to after several months, but apparently it doesn't get easier. Like this morning, when a coworker had asked, "Hey, how's it going?" I had tried for a smile before remembering that he couldn't see it beneath my mask. "The same as always, Pete," I replied, which is to say, not good at all, I thought. A few minutes after I had sat down, my boss had come to my desk. His face was obscured by a thick blue mask. "How's the report going?" "Fine," I had replied. "It's mostly done." "Great. James, I'll be needing you to finish the one that was due for next week by Thursday," he had said. I know these are challenging times and it's hard to keep up, but we need it." "If these are challenging times, then why aren't you doing anything to make them less challenging?" I wanted to shout. God, I was so sick of the whole, "Hey, it's been difficult, so here's how we're going to do absolutely nothing to make it easier" charade. I'd rather they just stop talking about it if nothing was going to change. It wasn't that I hated my job. It was a fairly reliable one and I've always been satisfied with it. But that was back before COVID, when I had a life outside of work. Since it's been so long since I've gone anywhere or done anything else, I could always think to myself that eventually things would go back to normal. But in all honesty, I'm starting to forget the way life was before. And after months of this, it's hard to believe that things won't be like this forever. It had started when a coworker walked by my cubicle. I kept my head down, expecting whoever it was to pass by. To my surprise, she approached my desk. I look up to see a woman who worked at the cubicle to the left of mine. "James?" she began. "Hey, Miranda," I greeted her. As I spoke, I noticed how stuffy the air inside my mask was. My breath was hot and muffled, and the warm temperature of the room wasn't helping either. "What do you need?" She gave a small smile, or at least her eyes suggested she was smiling beneath the mask. I realized I hadn't seen her whole face in a long time. "I just bought a new package of masks yesterday. These ones are much more comfortable and durable, and they're made of better material too." Her own mask was red. "Oh, that's great. Where did you get them?" My mask seemed to grow more uncomfortable against my face. The damp muffle of fabric was such a heavy sensation that I almost twitched against the urge to tear it off. "Aw, come on," Miranda said sweetly. "I want to give you one for free. People around the office had been acting so disappointed all the time." I noticed the fabric over the front of her mouth shifting as she spoke, almost as if her tongue was sticking out of her mouth and poking against the fabric. But that couldn't be right. "I just wanted to do something nice for everyone." I'm not sure about this." I stared more closely at her mask. "Where are the masks right now?" The cloth of her mask was pale, and I could almost make out the outline of a dark shape behind it. Were those her lips? Maybe she was wearing dark lipstick. "In the break room," she gestured. "Come with me. Just take off your mask." Did women even wear lipstick under their mask? I wondered what Miranda looked like right now under her mask. "It's fine." I tried to recall what her mouth looked like. "I'm managing fine with my own mask, but thanks for the offer though." I suddenly realized I couldn't remember what she looked like at all. Miranda laughed. I was just playing around. I wanted to see her face again. Huh? I tried to picture her face beneath the mask. Nothing came up. I said I wanted to see your face again. So why don't you take off your mask? Just a few seconds. It wouldn't be for long. We haven't seen each other's faces in months. As though reading my mind, she teased. Do you even remember what I look like? Oh, of course, I stuttered. Why do you want to see my face? The thought that I actually didn't know what she looked like wouldn't leave my mind. James, she groaned. I just wanted to see a friendly face. Me? We didn't even know each other that well, and never spoke much even back in pre-COVID days. Let's take them off for a short while. Don't you miss the human connection? Miranda coaxed. You know, of being able to see another human face to face. Aren't you too tired of being all alone and isolated all the time? If you take your mask off, I'll take mine off too. I did miss all of it. The blank space where her mouth was supposed to be, in my imagination, was suddenly all-consuming, like an itch that could only be abated by seeing her real face with my eyes. At that moment, I wanted nothing more than to see her face. Ugh, I don't know. I couldn't draw my eyes away from her. It isn't safe. The desire to take off my mask was overwhelming. Just for a few seconds, she begged. It can't hurt to do it. She raised her hands up to her face, reaching behind her ears. As though compelled, I mirrored her. To it, Miranda whispered as I looked into her eyes. My hands moved to my mask, and I watched everything through a daze. My hands seemed to be moving against my will. A quiet thud resounded through the room. Shaken from my trance, I saw that another coworker had dropped a heavy file on the floor. I regained my senses and tried to lower my hands subtly. Hey, I forced out a laugh as Miranda looked back at me. That was a funny joke, but maybe you should get back to work now. But her eyes darted around the room. I looked back to my work dismissively. By the way, maybe joke about something else next time. You know, people around here take the mandates very seriously. Okay. I ignored her as she walked away. My mind raced. The government has finally managed to flatten the second wave of cases, and you sure as hell aren't going to fuck it up by going and taking your mask off. And for what exactly? What even happened here? The urge to take off my mask was gone, but the horrible curiosity to recall what Miranda looked like under her mask was still there, pushed to the back of my mind. I ignored it and continued working. After a while, the thought entered my mind, unbidden, that she could have no mouth and I wouldn't be able to tell. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up abruptly and went to the break room. Lunch had passed a while ago, and the lights were off and nobody was inside at the moment. I walked around the big table, scanning the shelves and walls. There were plenty of framed staff photos for business events, awards, and the like. I've never really paid attention to them before, but I'm sure Miranda was in some of them. It was irrational, I knew, but I desperately needed to see her face for myself. There was a burning curiosity inside me that demanded it. As I reached the far side of the room, I heard several pairs of footsteps approaching. In a split-second decision, I ducked inside a small closet in the corner. I peered around the door to see Miranda and William, another colleague, enter. They were leading Jasmine, a newer colleague. Miranda spoke hushed. All right, the masks are just over there. Would you please take off your mask? Why? Jasmine asked. I don't think... Miranda sighed impatiently. William, she ordered. You know what to do. She began to remove her mask. "Hey, what?" Jasmine began. I held my breath as Miranda pulled the cloth away from her face. Her whole mouth was black. It stretched from one side of her face to the other, much wider than a normal mouth should be. Her lips were thin folds of skin that curled and peeled back to reveal a void of nothingness on the inside of her mouth. When she smiled, it was nothing short of demonic. At that moment, William roughly grabbed Jasmine, pinning her arms behind her back and peeling off her mask, and before she could shout, he clapped a hand over her mouth. Miranda surveyed her prey. I couldn't tell from her messed up mouth, but by the way her eyes moved, she seemed to be smiling. "It's time for you to join us," she said, her voice in an inhuman growl. Her lips parted. A bright red tongue, thin and lined with barbs on the side, started out. It twisted like a tentacle as she tasted the air. William loosened his hold on Jasmine, who gasped for air. Miranda struck. Her tongue shot forward, spearing through Jasmine's mouth and sticking into the back of her throat. Jasmine writhed for a few seconds, and blood dripped from her mouth. Miranda withdrew her tongue, and it slithered back between her lips. As I watched, Jasmine's mouth began to change form. Her lips curled into the same black shape on Miranda's face. After a few moments, she blinked and straightened herself. A thin red tongue slid over the side of her mouth. "You're going to help us infect the others," Miranda said. "There are many others of us out there." Jasmine nodded. "Who are we going after next?" William demanded. His mask was still on, and his voice sounded normal. Miranda shrugged. "I tried to get that boring guy in the corner, James. He wouldn't come with me. Why don't we let our newest member choose the next victim?" William suggested, gesturing to Jasmine. "Sure," Miranda said as she put her mask back on. "It's sure convenient that there's a pandemic going on," William added. "They won't see us coming." And with that, the three of them exited the room. I finally got up after I was sure enough time had passed and that they wouldn't be watching, then made my way back to my cubicle. On the way, I passed my boss. "I'm going home," I said curtly. "Pardon?" He looked at me in confusion. I briefly wondered if he had also been infected. After all, there were probably others like Miranda and William in the office. I tried to see if there was any hint of a tongue under his mask. I don't feel well." My tone was firm. "I'm going to get tested at the hospital. If I'm fine, I'll finish the reports at home." At home, I sat alone thinking over what I had seen. I couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation for it. I had no idea what had happened. But I do know that I won't be getting better anytime soon. I'll probably be sick for quite a long time and wouldn't be able to go to work. I'll also be buying some thicker mask. I might also layer some thinner mask on top of each other. It seems like those mutants need their victims to remove their mask in order to infect them, or maybe that only makes it easier. I have no idea what effect this would have on them. I can't tell you how many of them there are or how to hide from them, but I do know that they are definitely out there. They're hiding among regular citizens, looking like any other person. They could be anyone. So stay safe and watch out, guys. Ever since I was young, I preferred to keep my hair long. I was proud of it. The vibrant natural red that flowed behind me like fire. The way it curled at the ends, brushing against the small of my back. I liked how it bounced up around my shoulders whenever I would jump rope. Rapunzel was my favorite Disney princess, and I always dreamed of one day my prince climbing up my hair and stealing me away to somewhere far and beautiful. As a child, my mother would sit me down in front of her, take my hair in hand, and gently brush it. She would run her long fingers through my hair, working at the tangles from the day's play. It's a memory that sits with me still, even years after her passing. I remember when I was 8, my hair just touching past my shoulders, and I'd go to sleep with it like that, wild and free, and by morning, it would be the most tangled bird's nest you ever did see. But still, I slept with fanning out around my face, buried beneath my hair, until one day, I woke up to my hair braided and laying neatly against my shoulder. I was confused. I'd never braided my hair. The few times I pulled my hair up, it was in a ponytail or a bun, and it was usually when I go swimming at the public pool in town. When I walked out, fingers twisting at the ends of my hair, my mom was cooking breakfast, and so I asked her, "Mommy, did you braid it?" She smiled over at me, her own hair chestnut in color and tucked just beneath her ears. Mom opened her arms and welcomed me into a hug and said yes, she braided it to keep it from getting damaged. So it became a nightly thing after that. I'd go to sleep with my hair loose and free and wake up to a new braid sitting against my shoulder. At times, I wondered how she could do all of that and not even wake me, but I always had been a rather deep sleeper. But things changed when I turned 14 and my mother died. I was devastated. I'd always been close to her, and losing her at such a young age had certainly taken its toll on me, my brothers, my father, and everyone else in our family. But for me, in particular, it nearly damaged me beyond repair. I got into things that I shouldn't. Drugs, alcohol. I started experimenting, and I'd barely eat. I was destroying myself slowly, but surely, and no matter how much my family seemed to try, nothing they did seemed to help. It wasn't until one day, when I was 16, that I accidentally overdosed, did I finally get the help that I needed. They had me committed to a facility, and for me, that was exactly what I needed. While in the facility, I met a friend. I'll call her Kathleen. She was into sorts of things, crystals, spirituality. She believed in witchcraft and life after death. She didn't do anything bad. She's probably one of the nicest people that I've ever met, and only wanted to help people. But I got into it as well. I never did any of this stuff, but I believed in it. The idea there could be life after death? That maybe my mother is somewhere out there looking over me. It was comforting. When I was 19, I finally had gotten my GED, and I decided that I wanted to pursue fashion and moved out to New York City to do just that. My dad helped me rent my own apartment. We were lucky to be fairly well off that we could afford to do this and buy necessities as I got settled and looked for a part-time job just for my extra needs as I focused on studying in school. And it was on the 5th anniversary of my mom's death that it happened. I had taken to sleeping with my hair in a braid every night since my mom had died, taking the time to do it myself because it was a way that I found comfort, that I could be close to her even in her death. This particular night, however, had been the end to an incredibly long day, and I had actually passed out before even getting ready for bed. My books were on the bed, my phone long tumbled to the floor. Thankfully, it didn't crack, and my hair was a wild mess. I was just too exhausted to care. So, I slept like that. But that's not how I woke up. When I woke up, I first noticed that the blankets were now lifted over my waist and my books were in a night stack at the foot of my bed. It confused me at first. Had I woken up in the middle of the night and done that? Maybe I was just too tired and couldn't remember. I reached for my phone, but when I looked around, it was plugged in and lying on my bedside table, fully charged. But the weirdest thing was, my hair was fully braided and laid out over my shoulder, just as my mom had done for me as a child. I was spooked and confused at first. "Dad?" I called through my apartment to no answer, but I had thought maybe he had come for a visit. It wouldn't be the first time, but that wasn't the case here. I glanced down at the red that had calmed and faded from the fiery orange to a more subdued and darker auburn color. I twisted it around my fingers and felt confused, but strangely warm. Was it my mother? Had she done this for me? On the 5th anniversary of her death, the one night that I didn't braid my hair in years, had she braided it for me? She must have, I thought to myself with excitement. There could be no other explanation. I certainly hadn't done it after all. I had no roommates and my dad wasn't here. It had to be my mom. But I needed to make sure that I wasn't just imagining it. Maybe I did braid my own hair. Maybe I woke up in the middle of the night and was just so exhausted that I had done all that without even fully being awake. It's not like it's impossible. So I left my hair unbraided that night when I went to sleep. I woke up to the sun shining brightly through the cracks of the blinds. For a moment, I forgot everything as I stretched and yawned, and then I sat up, grabbing my hair. And it was braided. A braid laid out over my shoulder. The same exact braid as the night before. The one that my mother had used to do for me. And the one that I had been doing for myself since age 14, since my mother had died. It was real! My mother was visiting me. She was looking over me just as I thought she was, just as Kathleen had taught me was a real possibility. I felt warm and happier than I had in years to know this. She was beside me, and that's all I needed. From there, I left my hair unbraided every single night, and every single night, I would awaken to find that same braid laid on my shoulder and my things organized nice and neat if I had left them a mess the night before. At first, I didn't want to tell anyone for the fear they would call me crazy, but finally, I had to tell someone. I was bursting at the seams to let someone know that my mother was visiting me from the afterlife, that she still watched over from me in death. And just as I expected, my friend looked at me both as if I was crazy, but then, in worry. "Your mother is doing that?" she had asked, disbelief in her voice. "Who else?" I replied back, twirling my fingers through my hair, imagining they were my mother's instead. "You lock your door, don't you?" "Of course I lock my door," I sighed in exasperation. I'm not an idiot. I'm a young woman living alone in New York City, and I wasn't about to take that chance. Despite my friend's misgivings, I knew it was my mother. I had no doubts that it was my mother, and I continued believing this for months. One night in April, towards the end of my first year in New York City, bad cramps had made it difficult for me to fall asleep. I tossed and turned, and despite swallowing as much pain medication as I possibly could, my past with drug abuse made me wary of doing that. But nothing seemed to help. No matter how much heat I applied, how much water I drank, those damn cramps just wouldn't fade. But eventually, I did fall asleep, even though it was a light and fitful one. I awoke to the feeling of fingers brushing through my hair. The light tugs against my scalp as my hair was braided. I smiled because I knew it was my mother, but I didn't open my eyes because I was afraid that she'd disappear the moment that I did. So I let myself enjoy the moment, relishing in actually getting to experience it and not just wake up to it. Then I felt breath against my face, and my heart stopped beneath my ribs. My mother is dead. A ghost. Even if I could feel a ghostly touch of her invisible fingers running through my hair, I shouldn't be able to feel breath. She didn't breathe. Fingers petted at the firm braid as it was placed against my shoulder, and a strange smell of mint wafted up my nose as the breath got even closer. I could hear it. I could feel it against my ear. And then I felt a nose press against me, and someone took in a deep breath. "So pretty," they murmured, and I wanted to scream. I wanted to yell and freak out, but I bit it down on the inside of my cheek and stayed still as they held this position for I don't even know how long. But I knew it wasn't my mother because it was a male voice that spoke. I don't know how long I lay there pretending to be asleep, but I heard him move. He stood and shuffled about my room. I heard my book bag being latched shut, my shoes were being pushed beneath my bed, and finally, the footsteps receded towards my door. There was a slight pause before I heard it open, and then it was slowly and quietly shut. Then I heard the sound of a key being pressed into the doorknob and turned, locking my apartment as they left. I sat up in bed, quickly turning on my lights as I shook and trembled on the bed, weeping at whatever the hell had just happened. Tears streamed down my cheeks in a panic, and I grabbed my phone, quickly calling my friend, not caring that it was in the middle of the night, and asked if I could stay with her. She said yes, clearly worried over how upset I was, and I grabbed my stuff and left within 10 minutes. I moved shortly after, terrified to ever be in that apartment complex alone again. I later learned that the landlord had made it a habit of breaking into young women's apartments, stealing their things, and doing who knows what to all of them. Just the knowledge that he could have been doing anything to me in my sleep, and I never would have known if it wasn't for me waking up that one single night, terrified the hell out of me. I could still feel his fingers running through my hair, the feel of his breath against my skin. And so, I cut my hair off, keeping it curled around my ears, just as my mother had done before she died. And I never grew out my hair again. Hi, thanks for watching the video. I really appreciate it. If you want to send me a story to read, feel free to do so. My email is in the description of the video. And if you want to follow me on my social media, just to get updates or maybe to talk, the links and info for my Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram accounts are also in the description. And finally, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And turn that bell on to be notified for upcoming surprises. And remember, your fear feeds me.